Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about the books that I have recently finished reading. I'm going to be talking about 3 of them today. I'll talk about them in the order in which I read them. I don't do what I would call formal reviews. These are just my thoughts. I'm not always an expert in the things that I'm reading, so you can kind of take my thoughts as you wish. But it's just a way for me to share what I'm thinking, all right, and to document for myself what was going through my mind as I was reading these things. So the first one that I read was this, Mallory O'Meara's The Lady from the Black Lagoon, Hollywood Monsters and the Lost Legacy of Millicent Patrick. This has been on my shelf for a long time. I read this partly for Nonfiction November, and also because a couple of my podcast co-hosts, which I co-host a horror movie discussion podcast called the Horrorcast. 2 of them, women, have decided to create a female-centric podcast called Horror Through Her Eyes, and they also want to try and pick a book every month to read, and this was their pick. So I thought, you know what, Nonfiction November plus that, this is a perfect time for me to actually finally dive into this book, which I have been wanting to get to for a long time. I think it was published in 2018, maybe, and I've probably had it, or 2019, and I think I've probably had it on my shelves since then. So glad I finally got to this. So what is this? Mallory O'Meara, and I should say also I read this along with the audiobook that was read by the author, and I'll say she is a good writer, and she's also very good at narrating her own book. So if this ends up sounding interesting to you, I would recommend checking out the audiobook of this as well. But the way that I do audiobooks, I never listen to audiobooks that I don't have a physical copy of. I don't just listen to audio. I do immersive reading, or else I'll drive, and then when I get home, I go back through the pages again. So I'm kind of rereading when I do an audiobook. A good portion of the book I'm reading actually twice. So anyhow, that's how I approach these things. So this was essentially a look at Millicent Patrick, a woman who most likely was the designer of the creature from the Black Lagoon costume, essentially, from the Universal horror film from the 1950s. So she is probably the primary designer of that costume. She didn't necessarily make the costume herself, but designed it, and then her credit was essentially stolen from her. Or at least this is the case that Mallory O'Meara is making in this. Now, the guy who was in charge of the department back then was a guy named Bud Westmore, who was notoriously something of a prick. And what her contention is that Millicent Patrick designed the creature, but then Bud Westmore basically took full credit for it and tried to erase her from the memory of the creature from the Black Lagoon production, essentially. And he was largely successful in that until he died in the 70s, and she was finally able to speak out, although a lot of people by that point didn't really believe her. For various reasons, Mallory O'Meara is mostly focusing on reasons of sexism. So this is partly a biography on Millicent Patrick, which is not her birth name. She kind of, this is maybe one of her main professional names, and she had variations of it throughout her life, but she is somebody who, for various reasons, sort of reinvented herself over and over again. It is partly a book about her life and, what happened before the creature from the Black Lagoon, during, and then after, to the end of her life. It is also something of almost like an investigative journalistic memoir of Mallory O'Meara herself, and in her attempts to try and find out more and more about Millicent Patrick, the different things that she looked into, the places she went, the people that she talked to. And then there's a third part to this, which it's not third necessarily in terms of how much ink it gets, but it definitely gets a lot of attention. She has an axe to grind in this. So a good portion of this is also about, or I would say, exposing / railing against the treatment of women in the entertainment industry for the past century or so, which you could probably imagine is not necessarily good treatment. And sometimes O'Meara gives some of her personal experiences, which even in the well into the 2000s, she is still experiencing some ridiculous sexism. So that is something, like I said, that's a major axe that she has to grind in here. Sometimes, for my taste, she grinds it a lot, to the point where I felt like I was kind of, losing momentum of the story that she was telling. But of course, what she was talking about is still very important. So overall, I did really actually like this quite a bit. Millicent Patrick ends up being a fairly famous, sorry, not famous. This is the whole reason that this book is written, is because she's not famous. A fascinating person, somebody who is very likable, but certainly somebody who is flawed. But terrific artistic achievement, really good artist. I was not aware that she was also one of the very early female animators at Disney. And she worked on one of my favorite, or probably my favorite, absolutely my favorite, animation sequence from Fantasia, which is the Man on Bald Mountain where that giant demon is stretching out his wings. She worked on that as well. So it's two monsters that are pretty awesome that she worked on. And Omira, I think, does a pretty good job of laying out her case. Although I kind of wish that she addressed the other side's, basically the objections to Millicent Patrick being the designer. I wish that she had maybe more thoroughly addressed those. She kind of just dismisses them as sexism, without really laying out why they believe what they believe, and whether or not there is any good reason for them to believe what they believe. And therefore, she doesn't really do a thorough debunking in that way. So I kind of have to take her at her word that the other side does not have a good case. That's kind of a minor quibble. It seems like the evidence is pretty much in favor of Millicent Patrick. And yeah, I think you'll come out of this with a respect for the woman, rooting for her, and, finally glad that she's finally getting her due. And there are some images in here, not too many, but Millicent Patrick was quite a beautiful woman too, which Omira certainly doesn't let us forget. But there are images in here as well. So yeah, pretty good book. Like I said, have a few little quibbles here and there, but overall, I did really like this. I also, for a quick read, read Persepolis, The Story of a Childhood by Marjane Satrapi. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Now, I am aware that if you bought this today, there is a second part to this when she ended up returning in adulthood to Iran. And buying it today, you generally get both parts. This just being the first part. I got this for like 50 cents at a used book sale from our local library a few months ago, and so that's why I read this copy far cheaper. So if I ever get my hands on the second half, I'll read the second half too. But this was pretty good. This was a very swift read. It's the kind of book that could almost be, I teach middle school, and it's almost on the verge of being middle school appropriate. But then there'll kind of be, a swear here or there that wouldn't necessarily fit, that wouldn't jive with a lot of parents. So it's almost middle school appropriate, which means also that it's not complicated. It's not complex, really in any way. The story's pretty linear. And essentially it is about her childhood growing up during the revolution in Iran from the late 70s into the early 80s. And she goes from being young and feeling very revolutionary and liking communism and talking to God. And there's a lot of hope when they finally kick the Shah out. And then the country gets taken over by, excuse me, religious extremists. And again, the country becomes far more oppressive. And if she wants to live the kind of life that she wants to live, excuse me, I'm losing my voice here, she would really have to consider leaving the country. And a lot of people that they know along the way are unfortunately lost. This is, I had read last month Mouse. This does not get as dark as Mouse does. But still, it's a good window into somebody's experience during a very important period of time. So, yeah, again, glad I read it. It was a very swift read, very famous. I don't think I have to say too much more about it. And the last thing that I finished, I didn't begin this in November. In fact, I began this probably in the spring, I think. This is The Sword, Form and Thought. And this is a series of essays about the sword. All of these were presented, I think, in 2015. Was that the date that this... Sorry, I don't quite remember. It was around 2015, I think, at least. There was essentially an international conference held at the Deutsches Klingenmann Museum, basically the German Blade Museum. And these are a bunch of the papers that were presented. Not every single one. There are some that I talk about in the introduction that aren't in here that sound actually really fascinating. So there are a whole bunch of topics in here about the sword, all the way from basically prehistory up to at least like late 1700s, early 1800s. And they have various topics, or maybe categories they fall into. We've got, I'm looking at the contents here: typology, metallurgy and production, symbolic meaning and cultural perception, and fighting and swordsmanship. So they all fall into one of those four categories. And the essays, this is not really for like the casual reader. You have to be a real sword nerd to really want to get really dive into this. The essays are very academic. They can be kind of dry, which is why it took me a long time to read it, because what I would do is, after I'd finish reading a book, I'd basically pick this up and read an essay. And then I read another book, and then I'd pick this up and read an essay. So that's kind of how I got through it. And I was enjoying it every time I picked it up, but it's, you know, it's so kind of dry academic that cover to cover in one sitting just isn't really going to be satisfying. That being said, there were some really cool essays in here. I am a sword geek. I've always loved swords. I do own some real swords. Actually, that space behind me was originally going to be reserved for a sword rack, but then my wife put a desk there where she's sitting, when she works, and now she's afraid that if we put the swords there, the sword rack is going to fall on her and kill her. So we're going to have to find another place for my sword rack and put something else in that space, but that's what that blank space was supposed to be. But I've always loved swords, and I was able to get this from, was it Boydell Press, earlier this year with a pretty good sale, because these are actually pretty expensive books, but I was able to get a pretty good price for it. And even though some of the text can be a little bit dry, the images in here are fantastic. You have beautiful full color images of the weapons. So there are some, just gonna find some examples to show. So if you're somebody who likes, you know, archaeology and you know, primary sources, material culture, there's some really cool stuff in here. I'm just gonna try and find another. Here we have a grave with the sword. So yeah, the ones that I really ended up liking the most, there were some really good ones. Really cool topics. Material properties of the Ulfbert swords. We've got stuff about the Dark Ages, but the three that were really interesting to me were the ones on fighting. So there was researching Bronze Age swordsmanship, experiments in wear analysis, where essentially they took, they made reproductions of Bronze Age swords, and they put them through some abuse, and then they compared the, you know, basically the bends or the nicks or the scratches in their blades with historic pieces that were thousands of years old inside the museums, to try and match up maybe what might have caused it. Was it blade on blade contact? Was it against a shield or a spear? So that was actually pretty interesting. And there's one, Engenolf's fight book, Form and Thought Then and Now, about malpropisms, if I'm saying that right. Basically, these editions and these sword manuals, there's the so the sword manuals there. This was probably a manual not compiled by an expert, and there's a lot of errors in there. And I appreciated how, to lead us into this essay, he basically quotes from Army of Darkness, the third Evil Dead film, where our hero Ash is trying to get the Necronomicon, and he has to say 3 words, and he doesn't remember how to say them. So he raises, accidentally, an army of the dead. As a horror fan, I appreciated that reference to basically bring us into that essay. So yeah, anyhow, this is something that I know is going to be of interest to very few people, especially those who watch my channel, but it's definitely of interest to me. So those are three of the books, at least, that I read in November. I have to say, November is turning out to be a very prolific reading month for me. I'm burning through books very, very quickly. I don't know what it is. I don't know if I'm reading faster for some reason this month, or I'm just finding more time. But yeah, I'm able to get through them really quick. I have 2 more books I'm about to make a video on, so that'll be coming. So once again, I read The Sword, Form and Thought, Lady from the Black Lagoon, and Persepolis. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, thank you, BookTube.